All right, so we're diving into international trade today, specifically tariffs. It seems President Trump just imposed some new tariffs on imports from Canada, Mexico, and China. And get this, he's setting national security concerns relating to illegal immigration and drug trafficking.
Oh, wow, really? That's pretty unusual. It's not often you see those issues linked directly to tariffs, is it?
Yeah, it's a pretty interesting angle. We're talking like a 25% tariff on most goods from both Canada and Mexico.
Right.
Although energy resources from Canada are a bit lower at 10%, there's also a 10% tariff being imposed on imports from China. And that's what we're going to be unpacking today, how these tariffs could impact businesses, consumers, and those exchange rates. Those are always interesting.
Yeah, for sure. And I think it's really important to understand like the administration's rationale. The White House did put out a fact sheet that goes into some detail on it. And it's pretty clear that they are trying to use trade as leverage to address these national security concerns.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, the fact sheet even goes as far as saying that access to the American market is a privilege. It's almost like, a message directly to these trading partners.
Yeah.
But I think before we get into like the potential impact, it's helpful to understand the legal framework behind this whole thing. Like, how can he just impose tariffs?
Right. Well, the fact sheet cites the International Emergency Economic Powers Act, IEEPA for short. And it says this is the basis for the tariffs. And this act, it's a pretty powerful tool. It grants the president broad authority to impose economic sanctions during national emergencies. So basically, President Trump declared a national emergency because of illegal immigration and drug trafficking, particularly fentanyl. And this declaration then allows him to impose these tariffs.
Okay, so that makes sense, but it still seems pretty extreme.
Yeah, definitely.
So the fact sheet also, talks about the economic significance of trade for these countries, for Canada, Mexico, and China.
Yeah.
And it gives some, interesting statistics. For example, it says trade accounts for 67% of Canada's GDP, 73% of Mexico's, and 37% of China's. So clearly, trade plays a vital role in their economies.
Those are huge numbers, yeah. For comparison, trade only accounts for about 24% of U.S. GDP. So it's clear why, the administration might be viewing tariffs as a way to put pressure on these countries.
Yeah, that makes sense. Okay, so let's get into the nitty-gritty. How will these tariffs actually play out in the real world, like for businesses? What are the implications for companies that rely on imports from these countries?
Well, let's say you are a furniture manufacturer,
Yeah.
right? And you rely on Canadian lumber to make your products. Well, now with the 25% tariff, your costs for that lumber just went way up. And this could force you to increase your own prices, potentially making your products less competitive. And that's got to be a tough spot for businesses.
Right, for sure. And it's not just lumber, right? This could affect any business that relies on imports from these countries.
Exactly, yeah. The auto industry is a great example. I mean, parts often cross borders multiple times during the manufacturing process, right? So these tariffs could really disrupt those intricate supply chains, leading to production delays, higher costs, and those costs could eventually be passed along to consumers.
So we can see price increases on everything from cars to furniture.
It's definitely a possibility.
Wow. And speaking of prices, could these tariffs also impact exchange rates?
That's a good question. The answer is a bit complex, but in theory, yes. Let me explain. You see, if these tariffs make imported goods more expensive, the demand for those goods might decrease.
Right.
And that could lead to a decrease in demand for the currencies of those countries that are exporting the goods. So in this case, Canada, Mexico, and China. Think of it like a seesaw. When the demand for one currency goes up, the other goes down.
Oh, okay, I see. So you're saying that Canada, Mexico, and China's currencies could actually weaken.
Yeah, it's a possibility. And then on the flip side, the U.S. dollar could actually strengthen, at least relative to those currencies. Because if American consumers are buying fewer imported goods, they're holding on to more U.S. dollars. But, and this is a big but, exchange rates are affected by a lot of factors, not just tariffs. Things like interest rates, inflation, economic growth, even political stability can play a part. It's kind of like trying to predict the weather. There's so many variables involved.
So it's really hard to say for sure what's going to happen with the exchange rates.
Yeah, exactly. It's hard to predict with complete certainty.
Okay, that makes sense. But let's go back to the business side of things. What can businesses do to deal with these increased costs from the tariffs? Can they adapt?
I mean, adapting is key, of course, but it's not always easy. One option is to absorb some of the cost increase themselves, but that's not really sustainable in the long run, is it? I mean, They could also try to pass the costs along to consumers by raising their prices.
But then won't they risk losing customers, though? to competitors who aren't affected by the tariffs as much.
Yeah, that's the dilemma, right? It's a tough balancing act for sure. Another strategy could be to diversify their supply chains. Maybe they could start sourcing their materials from other countries that aren't subject to these tariffs.
That makes sense. But diversifying their suppliers, that takes time.
Right.
You can't just snap your fingers and have new reliable suppliers.
No, you're absolutely right. It's a process. It involves, building relationships and vetting new suppliers, making sure they can provide the same quality and reliability. And sometimes finding a viable alternative, it just might not be possible. And that's when we start to see those disruptions to these very carefully tuned supply chains.
Right. Yeah, because if businesses can't get the materials that they need when they need them at a price they can afford, then things can get pretty messy pretty quickly.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. Delays, shortages, production bottlenecks, it all creates a really challenging environment for businesses to operate in. And we've been talking a lot about businesses, but what about the everyday consumer? How might they feel the impact of these tariffs?
Yeah, that's a good point.
Yeah.
We touched on the possibility of higher prices, but are there other ways that consumers might be affected? Can you give us some more concrete examples?
Sure. Well, let's go back to the auto industry. Imagine you're in the market for a new car. Because of the tariffs, those imported parts, they become more expensive, right? So that increased cost gets passed along from the manufacturer to the dealer and then ultimately to you, the consumer. So you might end up paying, I don't know, maybe a few $1,000s more for that same car. Or let's say you go to a clothing store, right? And you want to buy a shirt. Well, that retailer might be using fabrics that are imported from China. So with those tariffs, those costs go up, and that $40 shirt you used to buy, well, it might now cost you $60.
It's crazy how these things have a domino effect, huh? It really shows how interconnected the global trade system really is.
It really does. Yeah. Something that happens on one side of the world can really have an impact on people and businesses across the globe. And those impacts aren't just felt by these huge multinational corporations, but also by ordinary people, just doing their everyday shopping.
Mm-hmm. Right. And speaking of that global interconnectedness, you mentioned earlier that these tariffs could impact exchange rates as well. Can you talk a little bit more about that?
Yeah, sure. So when a country puts tariffs in place, it makes those imported goods more expensive, right? And so naturally that can lead to a decrease in demand for those goods. And when the demand for the goods goes down, the demand for the currency of that exporting country tends to go down as well.
Okay, so if American consumers are suddenly buying fewer products from Canada because they're more expensive because of the tariffs, the demand for the Canadian dollar could go down.
Exactly, precisely. And when the demand for a currency goes down, it weakens relative to other currencies. It all boils down to supply and demand, really.
So we could see the Canadian dollar weaken, the Mexican peso, the Chinese yuan, all weaken against the U.S. dollar.
It's certainly possible, yeah. And on the other side of that, because American consumers are buying fewer imports, they're holding on to more U.S. dollars. And so this can increase the demand for the U.S. dollar, which could potentially strengthen its value.
So it really is like a seesaw. One currency goes up, the other one goes down.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it. But remember, we have to keep in mind that exchange rates are impacted by a lot of different things, not just tariffs. We're talking interest rates, inflation, economic growth, even things like political stability. It's complicated.
Right. It's not as simple as one action having a predictable outcome.
Yeah.
There's so many factors in the global economy to consider.
Exactly. Yeah. It's this constantly shifting dynamic system. And to be honest, it's really hard to predict the exact impact that these tariffs will have on exchange rates, just because there are so many variables to take into account.
It sounds like it. So we've got businesses potentially facing higher costs, consumers potentially paying more, and exchange rates fluctuating all over the place. It all adds up to a very uncertain economic outlook, doesn't it?
It definitely does. And those uncertainties are only heightened by the fact that these tariffs are being implemented at a time when there are already, significant geopolitical tensions around the world.
It does feel like we're kind of in uncharted waters here with all this. But this isn't the first time that President Trump has used tariffs, right? I mean, he's done this before as a policy tool.
Yeah, no, you're right. There is some historical context here that's worth looking at. During his first term, President Trump used the threat of tariffs to get Mexico to take action on border security. And he also imposed tariffs on steel and aluminum imports, citing national security concerns there as well.
Right. The steel and aluminum tariffs. What was the logic behind those? Like, what was he hoping to accomplish with those? And did they work? Did they actually achieve those goals?
Well, the argument was that the U.S. was relying too much on foreign suppliers for steel and aluminum, and that this could be a risk to U.S. defense capabilities. So the tariffs were meant to protect American jobs and also to boost domestic production of these metals.
So it was like a way to try and protect national defense, but also to help out American workers.
Yeah, exactly. That was the main idea behind it. But those tariffs also had some unintended consequences. For example, they ended up raising costs for American manufacturers who, rely on steel and aluminum, and that made their products more expensive.
So it's kind of a double-edged sword, isn't it? Like trying to protect one part of the economy could end up hurting another.
Yeah, it's true. There are always trade-offs to consider with these things. And with the steel and aluminum tariffs, we also saw retaliatory tariffs from other countries, including, close allies like Canada and the European Union, which basically escalated those trade tensions. And in the end, it really just ended up hurting businesses on both sides.
So tariffs can be kind of a risky move. Sometimes they work, but sometimes they backfire and cause more problems.
Exactly. And that brings us to the bigger picture here, right? These new tariffs on Canada, Mexico, and China, they're raising concerns about a potential trade war globally. Some analysts are worried that that's where we're headed, which would honestly be bad for everyone involved.
Yeah, that's kind of a scary thought. What would be the downside of a trade war? Why should we be worried about that?
Well, trade wars usually lead to higher prices for consumers, right? Because everything becomes more expensive.
Yeah.
And there are fewer choices in the marketplace because you're not getting as many goods from other countries. And then that usually leads to slower economic growth. They can also damage relationships between countries because nobody likes it when you start putting tariffs on their products. And they disrupt those global supply chains that we've been talking about.
So not exactly a win-win situation.
Not at all. It's important to remember that global trade, when it's done fairly and with clear rules, it can benefit everyone.
Yeah.
It allows different countries to specialize in what they're good at and trade with each other to get the goods and services that they need.
So it's all about finding that balance, protecting domestic industries, but also making sure that the global trading system stays healthy and fair.
That's the challenge. It's a difficult challenge, and it's one that policymakers are dealing with all over the world. And these tariffs are just one small piece of a much bigger puzzle.
It's definitely a lot to think about. We covered a lot of ground today, going from the specifics of these new tariffs to the bigger implications for businesses, for consumers, and for the global economy as a whole. Any final thoughts for our listeners before we go?
I would just say, stay informed, keep paying attention to these issues, see how these tariffs play out over the next few months and years, and think about how it might affect you, how it might affect the businesses in your community, and just how it might affect the world as a whole.
That's great advice. Well, thanks for joining us today for this deep dive into the world of tariffs and international trade. It's a complicated topic, but we hope we were able to explain the key issues and give you something to think about. Until next time, stay curious.